She held the baby in her arms, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Can you take me to meet Brandon? I want him to see his daughter." That's when I knew my wife hadn't just betrayed me. She'd built a new life and expected me to drive her there. My name's Graham. I'm a retired teacher, and until that moment in the hospital, I thought I still had a marriage. What followed wasn't rage. It was clarity. And that clarity changed everything. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you still loved, just to finally love yourself again? Let me know in the comments, because some truths don't scream, they whisper, until you're ready to hear them. Graham Whitaker stood by the frosted window, watching snow collect on the porch swing he'd repaired the year Lena stopped asking. The swing creaked slightly in the wind, a thin layer of snow curling along its slats. It moved like it had a memory of its own. That same swing had once rocked Lena to sleep after her mother's funeral, her body curled up and trembling as she tried to be strong at 20. Graham remembered holding her hand through that winter, the way she'd held his tighter when the pastor mentioned grace. But now, the swing swayed alone in the cold. He stood there longer than the coffee should have allowed, the mug warm in his hands, the steam gone. Lena had already left the kitchen in a rush, perfume still hanging in the air. She said she was going to the gym. It was Saturday, which meant she'd be back late, and mentioned something about Eleanor's Christmas choir or how Nancy's son had gotten into another minor accident. She'd say it lightly, like filling the space with harmless noise. The house was quiet now. Graham placed the mug down, the soft clink against the tile louder than it should have been. Outside, Brunswick Hollow was turning itself into Christmas. Strings of lights were being wrapped around lampposts. At the corner bakery, Mrs. Delgado had hung her wooden reindeer sign, and the smell of fresh gingerbread drifted all the way up Maple Street. A group of high schoolers from the local church youth group were rehearsing carols in the old town hall, their off-key harmonies audible in short bursts when the wind shifted just right. Graham pulled on his wool coat, brown, practical, with a lining that had started to fray, and stepped out. The wind nipped at his ears, but it wasn't enough to turn him back. He liked this time of year. It made the world feel like it was trying, at least, to be kind. At the Porchlight Cafe, the bell chimed softly as he entered. The place smelled of nutmeg and pine. Eleanor Boyd sat at her usual corner table, her gloved hands wrapped around a tall mug. She looked up and smiled when she saw him, the kind of smile that knew too much but never said so. "Thought you'd be sleeping in today," she said. Graham took the seat across from her. "The swing's making more sense than people lately." Eleanor chuckled. "Still out there?" "Still swaying like someone's on it." She stirred her tea. "James would have laughed at this weather," she said after a beat. "He always did. Said the cold was just New England's way of reminding you to slow down." Graham nodded. He remembered James well, quiet, courteous, always carried mints in his pocket. He was a good man. Eleanor smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "He listened," she said simply. "That's rarer than we admit." Graham didn't answer. Instead, he looked out the cafe window. The town center was bustling now. Volunteers were setting up the Christmas tree for the lighting festival. Children were building lopsided snowmen, and one toddler had collapsed into the snow, giggling while his mother tried to tug him up by the arm. "Are you two still doing the tree this year?" Eleanor asked gently. Graham glanced down at the coffee between his hands. "Haven't talked about it." "She's still going to the gym on Saturdays?" He looked at her, a little too long. "Every week." Eleanor didn't press. She never did. When he returned home, the house was warm again. Lena's coat hung by the door, and her gym bag was tucked neatly at the foot of the stairs. The smell of citrus and vanilla trailed faintly into the hallway, a scent Graham never liked but never mentioned. He found her upstairs, stretched diagonally across their bed, one arm flung over a pillow, her hair still pinned neatly back. She looked peaceful, the kind of peace Graham hadn't seen on her face when she was awake in a long time. He stepped closer, not wanting to make noise, not sure if he wanted her to wake up. That was when he heard it. "Brandon." Her voice was soft. It rolled out like breath, not a word meant for the room but for the dream behind her eyes. She smiled slightly and shifted, pulling the pillow closer. Graham froze. The name didn't repeat. But it didn't need to. He stood at the foot of the bed, staring. His hands stayed at his sides. He didn't speak. He didn't shake her. He simply watched. Lena's face was serene, almost young again. Her breathing deepened. She looked like someone untouched by regret. He turned and walked quietly down the stairs. The living room was still aglow with the lights they hadn't yet taken down from last year's tree, stuffed into a mason jar out of laziness. He opened the drawer of the side table and pulled out the small, leather-bound notebook he used each December. It had a list of things: trees to buy, lights to fix, pies to order from the church ladies. Every year he wrote in it. Every year he checked things off. This year, he flipped to a fresh page. Then he closed the notebook without writing a word. Outside, snow had thickened. The swing was almost buried now, the chains stiff from frost. The porch creaked with the weight of it all. Upstairs, Lena stirred. She turned over and, in that same dream-heavy voice, sighed with the comfort of someone entirely unaware. Lena returned to herself, sighing happily in her dream. Graham turned away, watching the snow begin to fall more heavily. Lena's phone lit up again. She turned it face down as Graham entered the kitchen with 2 mugs of tea. He noticed, of course. Not the message itself, just the reflex. The speed of her hand. The slight tremor in her fingers as she repositioned the phone screen down like it was something delicate or incriminating. She smiled at him, that well-practiced curve of the lips, and reached for the mug closest to her. "Thanks, love," she said, her voice light, as though the phone hadn't just sparked tension in the air. Graham didn't answer right away. He placed his own mug down, sat across from her, and looked at the wooden bread box sitting atop the old buffet cabinet. Years ago, Lena had kept a stack of envelopes in there, notes she wrote by hand during the holiday season. One in particular stood out in memory: Christmas Eve, maybe 2003, when she'd tucked a letter into his coat pocket that said, "I still believe in us." It was the kind of thing people only wrote when something was already slipping. He hadn't seen a letter since. And now the bread box collected more dust than mail. He sipped his tea, trying not to look at her face too long. The steam curled around his nose. Citrus and vanilla mingled with the spiced scent of the tea, and something about that mix tugged at him. It was the perfume. Not the one she'd worn when they met. Not the lavender and sage. This was newer, heavier. A scent she knew he'd never liked. He wanted to say something about it, to ask when she'd changed it, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded toward the porch. They started putting up the lights around town. "Looks nice this year." "Mm." Lena glanced up from stirring her tea, blinking. "Oh, yes. The tree lighting's next weekend, isn't it?" He waited to see if she'd suggest they go together. She didn't. Instead, she stood, took a small sip of her tea, and said, "I should get ready. Eleanor's choir needs help with setup." Graham didn't ask which choir. He just nodded. Later that morning, bundled in his scarf and coat, Graham walked down Maple Street, hands tucked in his pockets. Brunswick Hollow was moving at its December rhythm, slow but cheerful. Bells tinkled on the door of Old Town Books, and children's laughter rang from the snow-patched schoolyard. Outside the bakery, he paused. The scent of cinnamon and ginger caught him off guard. He stepped inside, welcomed by warmth and the smell of nutmeg. "Mr. Whitaker," called Joan, the shop owner. "2 scones, right?" He smiled. "Make it 3 today. I've got a coupon somewhere." He dug in his pocket, handed her the crumpled piece of paper, and looked around the shop while she packed the scones. From the back corner, someone called out, "Miss Lena not joining you today?" It was Carol, one of the longtime volunteers at the community pantry. Her voice was innocent, curious. "No," Graham said with a polite smile. "She's helping at the church." Carol nodded, but Graham caught the hesitation in her eyes. It passed quickly. He left the bakery and headed to the library. Eleanor had asked him to help her find books for the church's small reading corner, something about refreshing the shelf before Christmas Eve. Eleanor was already there, her coat half off, holding a mystery novel with a cracked spine. "I was just telling Edith how James used to eat up stories like this," she said. Something about this time of year made him nostalgic for clues and red herrings. Graham chuckled. "The old ones still work, huh?" She handed him the book. "Take it. You might find it says more than it promises." They walked together to the checkout desk, and Eleanor asked gently, "You and Lena still planning your holiday dinner?" Graham offered a noncommittal shrug. "She's been busy." Eleanor didn't press further. "Well, you're always welcome at my table. It's quiet, but warm." That afternoon, Graham stopped by the post office to send a card to his niece in Vermont. Inside, the heater clicked and wheezed, and old Christmas music piped softly from the ceiling. As he stepped out, just past the window display of snowy pine cones, his feet slowed. Across the street, half hidden by the crowd, was Lena. She was laughing. Not the polite laugh she gave at dinners. This was lighter, looser, like the kind she used to share with him on road trips. Next to her stood a man. Tall. Late 30s. A navy wool coat and gloves. He said something, and she reached out, touching his arm. "Brandon." Graham didn't need confirmation. The two disappeared around the corner. They hadn't seen him. He stood still, letting the cold press into his gloves. Then he turned back down the hill, toward home. That evening, Lena walked into the kitchen in a flurry of scarves and stories. "Baby shower," she said casually. "Amber's cousin. You remember Amber from choir, right?" Graham stood at the kettle. The water had already boiled. He poured slowly, steam rising between them. He brought 2 mugs to the table, sat one in front of his chair, and sat down. Lena pulled off her earrings, one by one. They did such a sweet job decorating. Lots of pink and white. It was. Graham placed her tea in front of his seat instead of hers. She stopped mid-sentence, glancing at the misplaced mug. He said nothing. Just sipped his tea in silence. Later that night, when she went upstairs, he stayed behind. The living room was lit by the soft glow of the corner lamp. He picked up the book Eleanor had given him, turned it over in his hands. He opened to the first page. "Every truth begins as a quiet suspicion." Lena smiled as she cradled the newborn. "Can you drive me to meet Brandon? I want him to meet his daughter." The words landed without apology, without hesitation. Like a favor one asks of a kind stranger, not of a husband. Her voice held no edge, only a brightness that belonged to a woman freshly celebrated, rosy cheeks, hospital bracelet still snug on her wrist, soft robe wrapped around her shoulders. The baby squirmed gently in her arms, unaware of the weight in the room. Graham stood in the doorway, unmoving. The air inside the hospital room was warm, thick with the scent of lavender sanitizer and faint cocoa drifting in from the nurse's station. Just outside, holiday lights blinked along the hallway railings, red, gold, green, cheap plastic clipped onto every corner in a half-hearted nod to festivity. A speaker above the door played Silent Night, barely audible beneath the hum of machines. He stepped forward, his boots quiet on the linoleum. Lena looked up, her smile unwavering. He should see her, she continued. "Don't you think?" The question didn't need answering. Graham let it pass like steam from the nearby cup of untouched hospital cocoa. His eyes drifted down to the metal tray by the bed. On it, a crisp birth certificate sat half-folded. He picked it up, slowly. There it was. Brandon James Holloway. Father. He blinked once, the name blurring only slightly before coming back into sharp focus. His thumb pressed along the edge of the paper. Then, without a word, he tore it once down the middle. Then again. And again. The pieces floated down like dry leaves. Lena gasped. "Graham." Still silent, he opened the drawer of the bedside table. Inside was a pale blue envelope, hospital forms, discharge notes. He rifled through them until he found the old pocket watch. The one he had given her on their 10th anniversary. A little inscription on the back, "For every second, with love." He took it back. Nancy rose from the chair in the corner, the indignation already gathering in her voice. "You can't do this here," she said. "Lena just gave birth. You're making a scene." Graham turned toward her, calm as still water. "I haven't raised my voice." Nancy walked closer. "You're abandoning your wife. And that baby?" "That baby," he said softly, "has a father. According to everyone in this room, it's not me." Nancy flushed. She made a mistake. Graham looked toward Lena. Her face was no longer radiant. She looked startled, lips parting as if to call him back to a script she thought she could control. "I stood beside her through it all," Graham said, still to Nancy. "But I won't stand in front of a lie. She needs you." She needed honesty more. Nancy stepped forward, hand outstretched, perhaps to plead, perhaps to scold. Graham met her eyes. "You want me to be the man she betrayed and the fool who stays. I won't be either. But you can't just walk out." He took a slow breath. "They're not mine to walk out on anymore." There was nothing more to say. The room had gone still, save for the faint whir of the heater and the occasional coo from the infant swaddled in pink. Outside, someone wheeled a cart down the hallway, its wheels squeaking rhythmically. Graham turned without waiting for another word. He stepped past the bed, past the edge of the floral curtain, through the door that hissed open and closed like a sigh behind him. The corridor was brighter than he remembered. He walked without haste, past the nurse's station where a small fake pine tree blinked on a table, past a bulletin board filled with photos of newborns and staff holiday messages. The air smelled faintly of pine-scented cleaner and peppermint candy. As he pushed the lobby doors open, the cold air met his face like a slap, sharp, pure. His boots crunched on the salted sidewalk. Across the lot, the steeple of St. Mary's stood tall against the fading daylight, its bells chiming the quarter hour in gentle tones. And then he saw him. Brandon. The man stood near the side entrance, holding a bouquet wrapped in crisp cellophane. Red tulips, white lilies. Too formal for love. Too late for redemption. He wore a tailored coat, wool gloves, and that self-assured ease that some men carried without having earned it. When he noticed Graham, he smiled. Not a taunt, not an apology. Just a smile. Graham didn't slow down. Didn't nod. His eyes brushed past the man like mist over stone. He kept walking, each step steady, each breath deep and even. At the car, he opened the door and caught a glimpse in the side mirror, Lena by the window, holding the child, her expression unreadable behind the glass. He turned the key, pulled away without a glance back. "Ra koi ben veen, Graham fay Brandon dung du, vui den, mem koi. Graham chinen le qua, roy buk vi fi xe." Nancy brought over a fresh pie and a pointed lecture. Graham accepted neither. She stood in the doorway bundled in a thick red coat, the pie tin wrapped in foil and hope. The scent of cinnamon and nutmeg clung to it, wafting forward like a memory he hadn't invited. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile people wore when they were bracing to be told off. "I thought you might want something sweet tonight," she said. "Lena said it's your favorite." Graham didn't move from the threshold. The porch light framed his figure against the warmth inside, while snowflakes drifted in lazy spirals around them. "She made this 2 Christmases ago," he said, voice quiet. "Right after her mother passed." Nancy shifted her weight. "She remembers. I do too." He didn't reach for the pie. Instead, he looked at it like a museum relic, something that belonged to a version of life that had been carefully curated, but no longer touched. "Graham," Nancy started, more insistently this time, "she's not proud of how it happened." She wasn't thinking straight. "The pregnancy, the hormones." "Don't," he interrupted softly. "Don't reduce betrayal to biology. She stiffened. You were married a long time. Yes. She says there's still hope. He stepped out onto the porch, letting the door fall closed behind him. The air was sharp, biting through his sweater and coat, but he didn't flinch. Nancy held the pie tighter. You're being cruel. I'm being clear. She pressed her lips together. The pie wobbled slightly in her grip. I won't fight with you on Christmas Eve, Nancy, he said. But I also won't pretend that this pie can sweeten the taste of what's already gone sour. He turned, opened the screen door, and gently placed the pie on the small table outside, the one where Lena used to set potted mums in the fall. Then he stepped back inside, closed the door with a quiet finality, and let the cold fill the space Nancy left behind. The silence afterward felt earned. Later that night, Graham walked the familiar path toward the town square. Brunswick Hollow was alight with its finest sparkle, strings of bulbs wrapped around railings, white lanterns lining walkways, children pulling sleds through powdery snow. The air hovered around 22 degrees, and every breath felt like a clean slate. As he passed the old brick church, he heard it. "O Holy Night," sung by a modest choir just inside the arched entrance, drifted into the street. The harmonies, imperfect but earnest, stopped him in his tracks. He lingered on the edge of the steps, not quite ready to go in. That was when he saw Eleanor. She stood to the side of the chapel, wrapped in a deep blue coat, her scarf tucked neatly at the neck. Her gloved hands were clasped, and her eyes were closed, not in prayer, but in presence. When she opened them, she turned to him as if she'd known he was standing there the whole time. "You didn't take the pie," she said gently. He managed a smile. "I didn't have the appetite for old recipes." She chuckled. Sometimes tradition gets too heavy to lift. They walked together down the block until they reached the wooden bench near the corner, the one facing the lit tree in the square. The wind had scattered pine needles across it, and Graham brushed them aside before they sat. He didn't live long, Eleanor said after a few moments, eyes watching the choir's silhouette flicker in the stained glass windows. But he lived right. James, I mean. Graham nodded. I remember how he used to hum through the hymns. He said it was his way of blending in, because he didn't trust his voice. I think that's how he lived too. Quiet, but full. They sat in silence for a while. The tree's lights blinked steadily in the distance, casting a soft glow across the square. I didn't leave because I stopped loving her, Graham said. I left because I started loving myself again. Eleanor turned to him then, something tender in her eyes. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a woolen bundle. It's unfinished, she said, placing it in his hands. James started knitting it during his last winter. Said he wanted to make something useful with his hands again. Graham looked at the scarf. It was about 2/3 done, uneven in places, the yarn slightly faded near the beginning. He never finished it, Eleanor added. Maybe you can. He didn't speak. Just held the scarf carefully, folding it once, then again. The wool was warm, despite the cold, and he tucked it into the crook of his arm like it might fall apart if held too tightly. The choir's final note hung in the air, then dissolved into applause. Eleanor stood first. So what now? She asked, not as a challenge but as an invitation. Graham didn't answer immediately. He looked across the square, toward the blinking lights that reflected off the snow like they were daring the night to be anything less than beautiful. Now? I begin. The letters were all still sealed, dozens of them, stacked neatly, unread. All from him. All to her. Graham found them in the bottom drawer of Lena's old vanity. It wasn't the drawer where she kept her brushes or necklaces or that faded floral pouch of perfume. No, this one was deeper, quieter, a place where dust settled without apology. He hadn't meant to open it, really. He'd been tidying up. Not because he expected her to return, but because the clutter spoke too loudly in her absence. Each envelope bore his handwriting, neat and deliberate. Some yellowed at the corners, others crisp, their flaps still sealed like mouths never meant to open. He traced the dates, anniversaries, birthdays, Christmases. They spanned years. Decades, even. He sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, letters in hand, the winter sun slanting across the wooden floor in narrow golden lines. Outside, the snow had begun to melt in patches. Roofs dripped quietly. The town was hushed under the weight of a Christmas morning, and even the birds seemed to wait their turn to sing. He opened the topmost envelope. The letter inside was dated 7 years ago. Lena. I watched you yesterday from the kitchen window, your back to me as you shoveled snow off the porch steps. You didn't know I was looking. I wonder how many moments like that I've missed. How many things I never said out loud because I thought you already knew. Graham folded the page, not finishing it. He didn't need to. He remembered the rest. He remembered writing it at the dining table, the tip of the pen scratching softly in the silence, the way his thoughts had poured out without filter, like confession. And she had smiled when he handed it to her, said, I read every word. But she hadn't. He opened another. Then another. None had been touched. In the quiet, something inside him shifted, not a break, not a sharpness. Just the cool certainty that he had been in love with an echo. A reflection. A memory he himself had built. He gathered the letters into a bundle, tied them with an old shoelace, and carried them downstairs. The fireplace had been dormant all morning. He set the bundle down beside it, took a breath, and lit the match. Each letter curled as it burned, folding into itself like it had been waiting for this ending all along. He didn't watch them turn to ash. He looked instead at the window, where a small brown thrush had landed on the sill. Its feathers puffed against the cold, and its black eyes blinked calmly back at him. He whispered, Live better than I did. The bird didn't move. A knock came at the door, soft and rhythmically spaced. Graham didn't stand up right away. He let the moment linger, the silence, the fire, the presence of something that finally felt like peace. He rose, and just as he reached the hallway, the phone rang. The answering machine clicked on. Hey. This is Brandon. I didn't know she was still married. I'm sorry. For what it's worth. Graham stood motionless. The message ended with a sharp tone. He stared at the phone, hand hovering. Then he picked up the receiver, held it for a second, and placed it gently back in the cradle without a word. His steps carried him to the writing desk, where a single sheet of stationery lay waiting, maybe out of habit. He pulled a pen from the drawer and began to write. Lena. This morning, I found the letters. All of them. Still sealed. Still mine. And maybe that's the truth of it, we were never in the same story, only adjacent pages. I wanted to say. He stopped. The ink glistened for a moment, then dried. He read the words twice. Then he tore the page in half. No more pages wasted, he whispered. Just as the pieces fluttered into the wastebasket, another knock sounded at the door. This one came with a voice. Graham? It's Eleanor. He opened the door to find her standing in her plaid coat, holding a small casserole dish wrapped in a kitchen towel and a covered plate balanced on top. Still warm, she said, smiling gently. The scent of roasted rosemary and apples filled the cold space between them. He didn't speak. Just stepped aside and held the door open. As she passed him, she glanced at the scarf now hanging neatly on the coat hook, James's unfinished gift, still there, still waiting. Beside it, a new pair of gloves. Not for Lena. Not for anyone else. For himself. The gym smelled like rubber mats in yesterday's sweat, unchanged, but Graham was not the same man who last stood there. He stepped inside with a calm that surprised even himself. The lobby was warm, slightly overlit, with posters for New Year discounts tacked unevenly across the walls. A young man behind the desk looked up, smiled wide through braces, and said, "Good afternoon, Mr. W. First time here this year?" Graham handed over his registration form. Something like that. The boy scanned it, nodded approvingly. New Year's goal? Not really, Graham replied, then accepted the complimentary water bottle with a small nod. He moved past the check-in area and down the corridor lined with mirrors. The soft buzz of fluorescent lights mingled with low-volume country music playing from a corner radio, an old Garth Brooks song about leaving a town and finding your name again. Inside the weight room, it was quiet, nearly empty. Midday on a Monday was not peak gym time. The windows let in pale light that spilled across the rubber floors, catching on chrome and steel. Graham paused near the row of treadmills, unzipped his jacket, and took it off slowly, methodically. He folded it over his arm and placed it on the bench. He wasn't here for nostalgia. And certainly not for confrontation. But life, as ever, had its own timing. Graham. He didn't need to turn to recognize the voice. Brandon stood a few feet away, his sweatshirt damp at the collar, a towel draped over one shoulder. He looked exhausted, less polished than he'd been at the hospital, more human now, though not in a way that earned sympathy. "I didn't mean to hurt you," Brandon said, eyes darting between Graham and the floor. Graham looked at him without expression. "Then don't say anything." Brandon froze, lips slightly parted like he'd braced himself for something more forgiving. But nothing came. Graham stepped past him without pause and climbed onto the nearest treadmill. He adjusted the settings quietly, placed his earbuds in, and began to walk. Not fast. Not slow. Just steady. Brandon lingered, unsure, then eventually drifted toward the free weights. No one paid him any attention. Graham's reflection in the mirrored wall stared back at him, not sharper or younger, but clearer. There was no anger in his face. No weight he hadn't chosen to carry. He didn't look triumphant. Just free. He stayed for 45 minutes. He stretched, wiped down the machine, and returned his towel to the bin. As he stepped out into the brisk January air, the cold hit him, but it didn't bite. Brunswick Hollow still wore its winter coat, but the sunlight was stronger now. The sidewalks were wet with thawing snow. The world wasn't green yet, but it wasn't buried either. Back home, the house greeted him with its familiar stillness. On the kitchen counter sat a folded note in Eleanor's tidy script, held down by a small packet of chamomile tea. "Sunday hike still on?" It read. Graham smiled, tucked the note under a coaster, and filled the kettle with fresh water. As it heated, he took the tea bag out, unwrapped it, and placed it gently into his favorite mug, navy blue, chipped at the rim. He sat at the kitchen table, steam curling upward. The windows fogged slightly, but beyond them, the air was clear. The snow had receded along the walkway. Icicles dripped in slow rhythm from the porch eaves. He reached for the leather-bound journal he hadn't touched since before Christmas. Opening it to a fresh page, he uncapped his pen and wrote one line. "Forgiveness didn't set me free. Clarity did." Even in the stillness of winter, some beginnings arrive quietly, on a treadmill, in a teacup, or within the silence of one's own reflection. Graham didn't rise from betrayal with bitterness, but with clarity, the kind that doesn't demand apologies or revenge, only truth and peace. Sometimes, it's not the grand gestures that save us, but the quiet decision to stop chasing what was never ours. Betrayal, after all, is not the end of love, it's a doorway to loving ourselves again, wiser and stronger. Like the slow melt of snow beneath January sun, healing takes time, but it always comes. And if this story lingers with you, perhaps let it remind someone else. Strength often sounds like silence and looks like a man walking home with nothing but his own name.